What's the downright scariest thing that has ever happened to you? Story 1. When I was 16, I was at a local mall by myself. I noticed a large man kept going where I would go and just gave me a bad gut feeling. After about 15 minutes of him following me around, I went into a Starbucks and sure enough, he followed. This Starbucks was right next to the mall's public restroom, and I so foolishly decided to go into the women's room, thinking he would not follow. I went into a stall, locked the door, and pulled my feet up so they could not be seen since the stalls did not continue to the floor. No more than 10 seconds later, I heard the bathroom door open and someone walking in. The man stopped in front of my stall door and just stood there facing it for what felt like minutes. He was so close to the door, his boots were pressing into the stall. Then without any words spoken from either of us, he left and I never saw him again. Scariest few minutes of my life, and I am still so upset with myself for isolating myself in a bathroom. Story 2. I went to the grocery store, and a man wearing a heavy jacket kept following me to every aisle. I do not know how many aisles he had followed me for, but it stood out to me because it was over 100 degrees that day, and I thought he was dressed oddly for the weather. By the time I reached checkout, I did not see him anymore, and thought it was just a strange coincidence that he had been on so many of my same aisles. I paid and grabbed my 2 bags and made a quick stop by the ladies' room because I had to pee and I was headed to the beach where there was no public bathroom access. I went into the first stall out of 3. About a minute after I sat down, I heard the door open. There was a space between the door and a partition on the other side about half an inch wide in these stalls, and I just happened to look up and saw a flash of jacket. It felt like my heart stopped. A few seconds passed by and I heard footsteps go past my stall. It sounded like the feet stopped and came back. The man pressed his face to the space between the door and partition. I had only looked up for a split second before I processed what was happening, and I was so afraid. I just looked down, but I felt him staring at me. I was humiliated. I did not know what to do. After about 20 seconds, I sensed that he had moved away, and in an instant, I heard the door and he was gone. I was shaking so badly that I could barely pull up my pants. I left my bags and did not wash my hands. I was more terrified than I have ever been running to my car. My hands shook the whole way home. I am furious with myself to this day. I do not know why I froze and just sat there humiliated. That is not who I am. I play it over and over in my mind, wishing I had clawed his eye out. I wish I had fought back or at least notified someone at the store instead of running away. Story 3. I was about 5 or 6 years old living in Dallas, and I was in the nurse's office when the tornado warning siren went off. The nurse ran out of the room toward the other side of the school, leaving me behind. The lights had gone off and I did not want to be alone, so I went to follow her and ended up on this ramp that connected both sides of the school. To the right of me was the cafeteria, and on my left was a wall with floor-to-ceiling windows. It was so dark outside that I could barely see anything out the window. The sound of the siren combined with the intense wind scared me the most. By this point, I was in tears, and I just stood there for who knows how long because I was so scared. Then the vice principal came running up the ramp, scooped me in her arms, and asked whose class I was in. I remember walking into the classroom and seeing my teacher with a flashlight in her hands, huddled with the other students in the middle of the classroom. 16 years later, Ms. May is still my hero. Story 4. I always try to forget about this, and whenever it gets stuck in my head, I find that writing about it helps, so I may as well. This was 3 or 4 years ago. My friend and I were driving down a road in a very rural area. It was the middle of the night and almost pitch black out. I was driving. We were approaching an intersection with no lights since it was a very rural area. My friend was trying to get my attention, and I caved and turned my head to look at her just as we were about to pass the intersection. Not a lot of cars in that area, especially at this time of night, so foolishly I did not slow down. I was petrified. We were passing through the intersection and a pickup truck was coming straight at us. The driver slammed on the brakes, honking at us, but it was too late. The truck hit us. I do not remember much at this point, just a lot of screaming. I woke up a bit later, on the side of the road I think, and the pain was overwhelming. I could not even tell where the pain was coming from. It just felt like it was everywhere. I could barely move. I woke up again later in the hospital, and was just sort of there for a bit, half awake, half unconscious. After a few days of me being fully awake and conscious, two of my friends came into the room with a nurse. One of them broke down into tears as they told me my friend, who had been in the car with me, had died in the crash. I did not even fully understand it until I was released from the hospital. From then on, it was a mix of constant fear, guilt, and sadness. I had a broken arm and leg, cuts and bruises everywhere, and a mild concussion. For the next few days, I just skulked around my apartment. I did not go to work or anywhere as hard as my roommates tried. I just sat around mindlessly watching television or staring out the window. My roommates hung around more too, more for me than out of mourning. They brought me food and made sure I was comfortable, although I think they were worried I might harm myself. The thought of harming myself never crossed my mind. All I could think was that I was responsible for my friend's death. After a few days, my roommates came back, but they brought someone with them. It was the truck driver. I did not recognize him at first, but he immediately broke down into tears when he saw me and started to beg me to forgive him. We both blamed ourselves for what happened. He came by for an hour or so every day for 4 or 5 days, and we just talked. Not always about the crash, but about anything. It really helped me feel better to learn that he was as guilt-ridden as I was. The day before I last saw him, I left my apartment for the first time in a week. I have not seen him since, and I hope he has made peace with himself. Story 5. Two of my friends were spending the night at my parents' house. We were all still in high school. My bedroom was a room away from the kitchen, connected by a pantry and hallway. I heard the back door handle jiggle, which meant a cat wanted to go outside, so I went to let it out and get a drink. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed there was no cat there, and the door to the basement was wide open, which we always left closed and locked. So I closed and locked the basement door a bit unnerved, but it did not matter. Next to the basement door was a staircase that went upstairs to the second floor, which is relevant later. A couple hours later, I heard the fridge door close. I noticed that because I did not hear it open, but it was in a different room, so that was not too strange. What made it strange was that I did not hear anyone walk down the stairs or by my bedroom from the front of the house. The back stairs to the second floor were really loud and creaky, so I would have heard something. Unnerved, I took a knife and went into the kitchen. I saw no one in there, but immediately noticed smoke coming up from under the basement door. I opened it, and it was filled with smoke. Closed it, got my parents up, called the fire department, and got ready to sleep in my car for the night, as it was about 4 a.m. at this point. A firefighter came and told us it was okay to go back into the house. For some reason, the furnace had caught fire inside and was filling the house with carbon monoxide. Had my friends and I gone to sleep, we would all be dead. Still have no clue what jiggled the doorknob or closed the fridge, but it kept me alive. Story 6. I was kidnapped when I was 9 years old. I was walking to my friend's house, which was right up the street, maybe 6 houses down or so, not far at all. My mom had told me to be home for dinner at 6 p.m. When I was walking, I noticed a man following me in his car. I naturally get anxious anytime I see someone while I am walking to this day. Anyway, I started walking a little faster, kept thinking to myself only a few more houses, 3-2. Then he stopped, got out, and grabbed me. Quicker than you can say, actually I cannot think of anything, but it happened really fast. Luckily, my friend's dad was sitting on the porch and saw this happen, so he started chasing after the car, running as fast as he could. The man had me sitting in his lap while he was driving, holding me down with one hand, covering my screaming mouth with the other, and kept shouting, "Shut up." My friend's dad eventually caught up to the car about 10 blocks down, out of breath, holding onto the side mirror, running with the car, trying to get the door opened. He finally decided it was best to punch through the window and pulled me out of the car with his then bloody hand. He carried me back to my house while I was crying and shaking and told my mom everything. I was traumatized. She reported it to the police, but to this day, we do not know who that man was. Story 7. I was a firefighter. We got called out to this gas station one evening at the beginning of summer. This was a big gas station with a restaurant and shop, and there were a couple of rooms for rent on the second floor. This thing was not your typical little corner station. My best friend and I had been in and out of this building for the last hour, fighting a pretty decent blaze. I want to say we were both on our third hot swap 30-minute air bottle. We were making good progress, fighting the flames back, and we were pretty deep into the building when we heard the air horn on the truck blare 3 long blows, which is the emergency evacuate signal, and our fire chief came over the radio frantically calling for an immediate evac. This usually happens when the structural integrity of the building is starting to fail and the building is about to collapse. Since the fire did not seem that bad, my friend and I were very confused, but trusted there was something happening that we did not know about. So we started to make our way back toward the door. Unbeknownst to us, about 2 minutes earlier, the business owner had shown up on scene and asked if there was any chance we could save his fireworks. This was about 3 weeks before the 4th of July, and he had just gotten in an 18-wheeler full of fireworks that were currently filling the back storeroom. Our fire chief, not worrying about saving the fireworks, realized that there were several thousand pounds of gunpowder and explosives in a burning building that happened to be full of his crew, including me. 2 minutes after that, my friend and I turned a corner, about the same time the fire made it to the back storeroom. For those of you who have never been inside the middle of a fireworks display, it is even more impressive from 10 feet away than it is from the few hundred feet below, where you usually see one happening. It was absolutely one of the most intense things I have ever seen. There were bright, vibrant colors and deafening pops all around us. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew it was not good. We grabbed at each other and tried to pull each other to safety. The floor in the restaurant's kitchen was slick from the thin layer of grease that had built up on the floor over the years, being heated by the fire and then covered with water from the hoses. It was like a nightmare slip and slide getting out of there. Fortunately, the fire had only hit a small batch of the fireworks when we were in the building, or I would probably not be here to tell you this story. We pulled everyone out of the building, set up deck guns and aerial-mounted deluge guns, and performed what we call a surround and drown, and watched the rest of the fireworks. Either that or the time I was fighting a woods fire, and the fire crown spread overhead in the trees and dropped back behind us, trapping us in a ring of fire, cutting us off from supplies, equipment, and help. Both were terrifying, but the fireworks story is more impressive to tell. Story 8. When I was younger and visiting my parents, I took my stumpy never-met-a-stranger, Lab Mutt, out to go potty around 5 a.m. At the end of the super long driveway, I ran into a guy just kind of hanging out in the pine trees. He asked for a cigarette, and when I said I did not have one, he wished me a good night. The whole time, my happy little dog, who must have been about 10 months old, was straining toward him for attention. I got halfway up the driveway, and she suddenly lunged behind me, practically ripping my shoulder out of the socket. Just going absolutely wild, something I have never and still have not seen from her to this day 8 years later. When I spun around to get her under control, I saw the guy was just beyond her reach, running away. He had been following me up the driveway. Later, I remembered my family remarking over the few days I was there that it smelled like cigarettes around the front porch and garage. This guy had probably been hanging around our house. I do not know what would have happened had my dog not reacted the way she did. Story 9. I was asleep in bed one night, and my mom, who had recently taken interest in home security, had put a wooden dowel in my bedroom window and forgot to tell me about it. It was a redneck version of a window lock because we lived in an old house and did not have locks on the windows for some reason. I found out later there was an electrical fire in the hallway outside my bedroom, and I woke up to smoke slipping into my bedroom from beneath my door. Being a little kid, I was terrified and had no idea what was going on at the time, so being smart, I tried to get out my window, but I could not get the dowel out. I spent what felt like 10 minutes trying to get my little fingers around it and slip it out of the window sill, but could not. Finally, my mom got into my bedroom, grabbed me, wrapped a wet towel around me, and got us out of the house and me safely out of trouble. Best part, she went back in, got our fire extinguisher from under the kitchen sink, and put that fire out herself. Thankfully, it was not some huge home-destroying catastrophe. Story 10. My fiancé and I live in the sticks. We were lying in bed during a power outage about a month ago after burning a gibber, just talking and watching the storm roll out. Suddenly, I broke out in goosebumps, all of my body hair standing on end. There was a humming noise getting higher in frequency and volume. The neighbor's dogs started growling and whining. We had the window open and the curtains back, which we almost never do because our one neighbor has one of those giant annoying antenna lights that stay on all day and night. The yard and field were pitch black, the stars now out. I asked him if he felt that. At the same time, he said something is coming. The buzz cut out. A bright flash, so white that it dazzled my eyes for the next hour, seemed to light up the backyard and a mile around it. It resembled a close lightning strike in its brilliance, except the intensity seemed to amp up in brightness and then slowly dim out. It was like someone turning up a dimming lamp to the topmost setting from the bottom and then dimming it back down. I could see my neighbors combine over a mile away across their field. I saw their house, which you cannot even see when it is overcast and day, and that is when my internal freak-out sensor started braying. Why could I suddenly see my neighbor's ugly yellow gingham curtain? Why did the dogs sound like they were in pain? What was happening? I glanced at my fiancé, but he was squinting toward the sky. I looked up too, and it was like staring into the light at the dentist. I could not see anything. The neighbor's dogs started going wild, not just barking, but really howling. The brightness started to fade, everything going from washed-out white to a dim yellow, to an ochre-like color, to darkness again. It stayed black for perhaps 5 seconds, then another flash, this one massive and much quicker. There was no dimming or flash imprint on my eyes. From the start of my goose flesh to the end, the entire scene lasted about 60 to 70 seconds. Much longer than a lightning strike, and the bright did not waver or stutter like a strike does. Neither of us have an explanation, and people who hear it just say it is crazy. Just last night, my daughter and I saw hovering lights in the field. We went out to investigate today, and there was nothing amiss. We are going to start recording the sky nightly if this keeps up. Story 11. We had a baby monitor that, besides sound, also monitored the baby's breathing and set off an alarm. The alarm would go off on the baby's side to jar them and also on the parent's remote. One night we forgot to turn up the sound, and in the middle of the night I rolled over and saw the lights pegged. I flew out of bed screaming to my wife. Darting into the nursery, I suddenly found no baby in the crib. I suddenly realized my wife must have brought the little guy to our bed and forgotten to turn off the alarm. I wheeled around and passed her coming in and said, "He is in our bed," and she screamed because she knew for a fact this was not the case. My whole world stopped with absolute terror. She screamed, "Who took my baby?" Somehow, through massive adrenaline and fright, I figured it out. The house alarm was still armed, no windows or doors could have been opened, and the nursery door was closed. He had to still be in the room. I glanced around and saw the only place he possibly could be was behind or under the crib. I fell to my hands and knees, and there he was, on his belly, looking at me smiling, even though Mom was hysterical. I reached under and gently pulled him out by his ankles, and Mom, meanwhile, saw this and assumed he was not alive. Because how does a 1-year-old climb out of a high-sided crib when he cannot even stand and manage a 4-foot fall unharmed? She scooped him up and cried for an hour, rocking him. I did not sleep that night. That little monster has had us guessing ever since. Story 12. So one night I was carpooling with my friend to work. Just her and I driving down this rarely used back road that happened to be a shortcut to work. I would say it was about 10 in the evening, and there were no other cars in front or behind us. The road we were on was a very old one and had not been renovated in years. There were no lights on this road whatsoever, just the ones coming from the car's headlights. We were driving along for a good 15 minutes, and then we suddenly came to a stop sign that was literally in the middle of nowhere. My friend, who happens to be a very careful driver, slowly pulled up to the stop sign for fear of possibly running past it. Heaven forbid we make a rolling stop in all this traffic, right? So the car was fully stopped, and I was looking out the window. It was about this time that I saw this lady standing there on the corner. She looked to be in her mid-40s and was in something that resembled a white coat and pants. Because there was not much lighting, I could not make out much of her face or anything of that nature. But seeing someone standing there struck me as extremely odd. I was thinking to myself, who in their right mind would be out here in the middle of the night? So I turned to my friend and asked her if we should maybe see if she needed a ride or something, to which my friend replied, "She," and I said, "Come on, you cannot tell me that is a man now." Then silence. Suddenly my friend looked me dead in the eye and told me she had absolutely no clue what I was talking about. I thought she was joking and said, "You cannot be serious. I am talking about that woman over there." As I was saying this, my eyes panned over to where the lady had been standing, and nobody was there. So there we were, idling at a stop sign in the middle of nowhere, with absolutely nobody else around. I suddenly got this sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach and started to freak out a bit. I was not crazy. I knew exactly what I saw. I mustered up enough energy and yelled, "Go! Let us get out of here!" And we took off like a bat out of hell. From that point on, I refused to look in the rearview mirror and pretty much kept my eyes closed for the rest of that ride. Not much was said after that, nothing at all. The following week, I told this story to one of our coworkers, and he told me that several years ago, a lady had been brutally murdered around that area. Apparently, this person was a nurse and was either on her way to or coming back from work when she was attacked and killed in the middle of the night. The more he continued, the more freaked out I got. I kept remembering the white outfit I saw this lady in. It was very similar to that of someone who worked in the medical field. Even now, I get chills thinking about it. Up until this day, I refuse to drive down that back road. Day or night, I am not doing it. And if I absolutely had to, I would run that stop sign like you would not believe. Story 13. Back in May, I got together with my now roommate and went hiking with a bunch of his friends. We reached the top of the mountain where there was a cliff and scenic overlook. After a few minutes of taking pictures, we went off to a trail that led to the side. Soon after we left, I heard the most terrified scream. I immediately ran back to the cliff where I saw a middle-aged man sitting at the edge with a devastated look on his face. I asked a woman next to me what had happened, and she said his wife had fallen off the cliff. The cliff was about 150 feet tall, so I knew there was little chance of her being alive. But if she was, people needed to reach her quickly. I ran to the edge of the cliff and looked over to see her body lying face down on the ground. While I tried to figure out how to get down to her, several people, including my roommate, were able to find their way down to her. She was unconscious with one side of her face caved in. Blood was flowing heavily out of her ears and mouth. Her ribs and pelvis had been crushed, and one leg was twisted 180 degrees. Amazingly, they were able to feel a pulse, and they heard gurgling, so it seemed she was still alive. One of the women at the top of the cliff was a psychologist. She yelled down to those caring for the woman to list out things that would have emotional response names of her husband, kids, dogs, and so on. Unfortunately, she was not able to respond to any of it. I learned later on that it was not long after they felt her pulse and heard gurgling that they knew she was dead. Apparently, gurgling is a sign of being brain dead, so she had died as soon as she hit the ground, but her body continued to function for a bit longer. Wisely, the people with her did not tell us that out of fear of making the husband even more upset. He was having a panic attack the entire time. One woman helped comfort him and try to calm him down. At one point, I heard her say to him, "It is not your fault." I assumed he just meant he should not have brought them hiking, which is normal guilt for people experiencing something traumatic. But I later learned how she fell. His wife was taking a picture at the edge of the cliff, and he tripped and bumped into her, causing her to fall. It only took 10 to 15 minutes for paramedics to reach the mountain, but unfortunately, she had fallen on the side of the mountain without trails. The quickest way for paramedics to reach her was to hike through the thick forest. It took another 30 minutes before they were able to reach her. When they arrived, they took one look and immediately threw a tarp over her. People stayed for a while longer to help with anything they could, but after a while, we decided there was nothing we could do. That night, we all had dinner together, and the day's events were the topic of discussion. We all gave our accounts of what we did and what we saw. Some of us had actually seen her fall. A couple of the guys had been down with the woman and seen her injuries. But despite how gruesome the scene was, all of us agreed that the worst part was listening to the husband scream. For hours, he could not help but yell. It was one thing to see something so horrible happen, but listening to that man, someone who loved her, had spent many years with her, and had 3 daughters with her, was more traumatic than anything. All of the others I was with went to the same high school, and their school found out somehow and immediately called them all into the office where they had a meeting with the school counselors. We were all still shaken up at the time, but most of us were okay. One girl had to have therapy for a little while. We are all fine now, but I still get chills whenever I think back to what happened. Needless to say, I will never stand at the edge of a cliff for as long as I live. Story 14. Me and 3 buddies were hanging out late one night in a car on a dark street. I picked this particular street because my grandma lived on it, and I was very familiar with the neighborhood. I knew the families that lived in most of the houses on that block, elderly people. When we pulled up, I surveyed the houses, everyone's lights were off, and we should have had no trouble parking there for as long as we wanted. I had the driver park in front of my grandma's friend's house on the corner. My grandma's friend, a lot like my grandma, was an older woman who went to bed early. No family lived with her and no husband. I had known her most of my life. Anyway, my grandma's friend lived on a medium-sized lot and her house was up on a small hill. The hill was small but pretty steep, a nightmare to mow. I was sitting in the back behind the passenger seat. The car was still running at this point, and we had not been there for more than 2 or 3 minutes. We had just begun our activities when I caught a glimpse of something moving in the passenger side mirror. I looked out the window and what I saw scared me then, and still scares me to this day over 10 years later. I saw the silhouette of a person lying on their stomach doing an army crawl really fast on the side of the hill, and it was headed right for us. This thing was moving quickly. I do not know how it is even possible on flat ground to crawl that fast, let alone on the side of a hill. It was not going down the hill. It was moving parallel along the side of it. I screamed for the driver to go now. This thing had covered serious ground in a matter of seconds. It was within 5 or 6 feet of my door when we squealed out of there. As we got to the end of the street and turned onto a main road, the driver and my buddy next to me in the back were yelling, "What was that? Was it the cops?" I could not speak. I was so shaken. It had only been 10 or 15 seconds since we bolted down the street. I just wanted to get as far away from that road as possible. I could not process what I had seen and did not want to. That is when it happened. I looked to my good friend P in the passenger seat, and he had an absolutely terrified look on his face. I blurted out, "You saw it too, did you not?" He did not say anything. He just kept looking in the side mirror and then back to the dashboard. By this time, my other 2 friends were getting mad and emotions were escalating. I told them I saw somebody or something crawling toward the car really fast. I asked P to back me up. All he did was nod, and then he asked us to drop him off at home. I wanted him to tell us what he saw, but he refused. All he would say was that he saw something. At the time, that was good enough for me. I was relieved I was not the only one who saw it and was freaked out by it. To this day, I do not know who or what it was. I hated going to my grandma's house at night after that, and I never wanted to be around her friend after that either. The thought of a 60-something-year-old woman army crawling that fast at 1 a.m. scares me even more. Story 15. I was in my jacuzzi with 2 of my friends, and it was getting really hot, so I decided to dive into my pool. I was dumb and wanted to do a quick dive because the pool was freezing and then jump right back into the jacuzzi, so I ended up diving right on top of a step. I blacked out for a second before regaining consciousness and could not move for another 2 or so seconds. I then pulled myself up onto the step and leaned over the ledge going into the jacuzzi. My back and neck were tightening up, and I could not breathe because I had just gotten the wind knocked out of me, and I was afraid I had broken my neck and was going to be paralyzed for the rest of my life, even though I was still able to move, but my muscles were tight. I started gasping while leaning over the ledge, and my friends were laughing because they thought I was joking and were saying, "Shut up, stop being annoying." I kept gasping because I could not breathe, and one of my friends said, "Gasp one more time, and I am pushing you back in." I gasped again, so he pushed me into the pool, and I pulled myself back up again and started gasping some more. He was about to push me back in when I reached up and touched my head, and I found blood all over my head. I then realized I had cracked my head open. Now you may be thinking the scariest part for me was knowing I had cracked my head open and almost broken my neck. Oh no, I was terrified that my mother was going to be angry at my stupidity. So being the genius that I am, I decided to wrap my head in some paper towels for the night and wait until the next morning for my mom to wake up before I did anything, because I knew waking her up at 1 a.m. would make her unhappy. So she woke up in the morning and I was scared she would get mad, so I threw away the ridiculous amount of bloodied paper towels I had acquired and went to ask her for help. As I was asking for help, she opened the trash can and saw all the bloody paper towels. She then looked at me, got mad for not waking her up because I could have been seriously injured, and then drove me to the hospital to get glued and stitched up or whatever they did to me. Oh, also the time I was in the car with my dad and we were getting carjacked and he decided to fight the carjacker. That was scary too. Story 16. Back when I was 18, I was working as a healthcare assistant at my local hospital while living at home. I was working an afternoon shift one day, so I was in bed at 11 in the morning. I was lying awake in bed when I heard a noise downstairs. 99 out of 100 times it is just in your head or the central heating. Unfortunately, this time it was not. I heard more noises and thought, this is real, there are genuinely people in my house. I had no idea what to do, so I got out of bed and was standing in front of my bedroom door in just my boxers. Cue the door opening and me finding myself face to face with a random Filipino man. I stood there frozen with fear, and he did the same for about half a minute, okay, maybe 3 seconds, before he turned and ran out of my house along with his accomplice downstairs, whose existence I was unaware of until I saw them running out of my gate. That was terrifying. But on consideration, nothing was scarier than the time my girlfriend was walking home alone and drunkenly called me because she was scared. Not much fun to begin with. When she dropped her phone and spent at least 20 seconds trying to find it in the dark, I nearly broke down. I do not mind getting hurt, but nothing on this planet is as bad as the fear of someone you love getting hurt. Story 17. I have posted this before, but for anyone interested, I used to live in a rented house that sat across the street from a fairly bustling city park. At night when the park was deserted, I would walk out my front door and sit on my porch and look at the trees and the stars. One night around 1 a.m., I opened the front door and started to sit down. That is when I saw a man standing in the deserted park. He was directly in front of my house. The man was dressed all in black and was wearing a Halloween skull mask. The mask seemed fairly intricate, but was definitely a store-bought cheap one. The sight of this guy sent a chill down my spine. He did not move at all, although I know he saw me. The entire neighborhood was silent and still, and we just paused there holding our ground. We watched each other for a long time, and then he walked away. I called the cops because I figured this guy was casing the neighborhood. Cops came, took my statement, and nothing ever came of it. A couple of months later, I was doing yard work around the side of my house. I was pulling a huge tangle of weeds out from a thicket underneath my kitchen window. I saw something that looked like trash, picked it up, and it was the mask I saw that night. Story 18, I was coming home really late one night, and I backed my car into the driveway as usual. It was a cloudy, dark night, and the porch light was off. The front porch of my house is old and made out of wood, and it is about 3 to 4 feet off the ground with space to crawl underneath. As I climbed the stairs, I felt my ankle get caught on something, tripping me up a little. I looked down and there was a hand grabbing my ankle. I gasped and kicked my leg back as hard as I could, breaking the grip. I then ran and frantically unlocked the front door. I finally managed to open the door and get in. I was terrified, but I looked out the front window through a crack in the curtains while finding the number for the police department. The cops showed up later, but did not find anyone, and they said they had never heard of this kind of thing happening before. They said they did not see any footprints or anything underneath the porch either. This was a couple of years ago, and I still live in the same house. I tell myself it was some kids from the neighborhood messing with me, or maybe my friends, though no one has ever admitted anything, but I will never know for sure. I did buy a motion-activated light for the front porch since then. Story 19. When I was 18, I used to work graveyard shifts at a yacht club, and one night during some downtime, I watched The Exorcist 3. The yacht club at night was creepy enough, with lots of creaking boats on their moorings, long, dark, poorly lit docks, no one around, and a fire station every 50 feet that included a fire axe, so a potential offender would always have a weapon handy if he needed one. I was doing my rounds quietly, walking the perimeter of the club, the empty clubhouse, and the lengths of the docks, trying not to freak out after freaking myself out. As I was almost finished, I was in a section of dock where some larger boats were moored, so visibility was even worse as I could not see over the boats. I walked past one boat when this huge figure, which had been totally quiet until that moment, suddenly lunged toward me, screaming incoherently and coming fast. I completely freaked out, and for some reason my survival instinct thought it would be a good idea to dive into the water. So it was 3 a.m. I was already terrified, and now I was underwater, could not see any lights, and then could not find the surface because I came up underneath a floating dock. I started panicking and somehow managed to find my way to a gap where I could breathe. I took a breath and then, despite still being in a complete state of panic, I found my way to the edge of the dock and looked up. There stood a crane still slowly opening and closing its wings in a threat display and still making some shrill, loud noise. It must have been sleeping while standing on a post between some boats, and since it was elevated, it looked even bigger than it was, and it was pretty big. I hauled myself out of the water, and as the tension and adrenaline left my system, I threw up into the water. I have never felt that kind of primal terror before, both when the crane initially scared me, and then when I realized I was underwater in the dark and could not find the surface. Story 20. When I was a junior in high school, I was home alone and heard the doorbell ring. Thinking nothing of it, I looked outside and saw that it was a man I had known since I was 7, friends with his daughters and all. Again, thinking nothing of it, I opened the door to let him know my parents were not home, but I could get a message to them, when my mom burst through the door that leads to our garage and threw her body at the front door trying to push it shut. Shocked, I just stood back and watched as the guy kicked our front door in and then turned to walk down the street to his house a few houses away. My mom explained that he was upset because she, the president of the homeowners association at the time, had made a decision he did not like. He had cut her off in his car minutes before coming to our house to yell at her about it with my 2 baby siblings in the back seat. We called the cops, but they talked us out of getting a restraining order because it was just a piece of paper and would not actually stop him if he tried something else. For about a month or 2 after the incident, he went out of his way to scare our family. He would walk down to the tennis courts where my stepdad was and get in his face, threatening him in front of everyone. And then he would walk back to his house, not before pacing in front of our house for 10 to 15 minutes, always at night. My mom dealt with a lot of paranoia during that time. She would hear the door open when she was the only one home and then close a few minutes later. I would not put it past him that he was doing something like that to harass our family. Eventually it all stopped and now we never talk about it, but it definitely made me want some form of self-defense, like a baseball bat in my own home. Story 21, I was 8 years old and home alone with my dad. I was sitting there pretending to do my homework while my dad was on the phone with his pharmacist. I knew his pharmacist pretty well since my dad had to go to the VA hospital every week to keep some stuff in check, though I am still not sure what all he had that needed monitored weekly. He had just been put on some new medicine, so he was on the phone explaining he was pretty sure he needed to switch back to something else. And next thing I knew, I heard a loud thud. I looked up and my dad was on the floor. At first I thought he was joking around. He was the kind of dad who thought scaring their child was hilarious, though I do not think he would have faked dying. But I was 8 and had never lost anyone close to me. How was I supposed to rationalize what was going on? I was in such a panic that it would probably have been 5 minutes before I rationalized calling 911 if it were not for the fact that I heard someone on the other end of the phone calling out. I picked it up and my dad's pharmacist asked what happened. I explained he was on the floor not moving, and he told me to go sit on the porch and that people would be there to help in a minute. Firemen and cops showed up long before an ambulance did, but one of the cops took me to my neighbor's house despite my protests, and we had to figure out where my mom worked. She had just started a new nursing job, and I did not know the name of the hospital. My parents were separated at this point, and she was living with my stepdad, and he was at work, so I could not call him either. I just knew she was a nurse and worked at the hospital, but nothing else. Eventually, they found where she worked, and she came to pick me up. In the end, my dad had died of a heart attack, and we were told that even if he were in a hospital surrounded by the best medical team in the world, he likely still would have died because of how hard and sudden it had hit. I may have only been 8 and lived with him for a few months, but I still miss him, even as I find myself barely remembering much about him. I still have issues to this day after witnessing that. I have trust issues with emergency response units. They took nearly 15 minutes to arrive, and the fire department was right down the street. And from the time this happened until I lost my insurance at 19, I had been seeing counselors off and on, and to this day have severe trust issues with emergency response units. It took over 10 minutes for even a fireman to come, though the station was right down the street, and when cops did show up, there were 6 cars and half the cops just sat outside talking and laughing like nothing was going on. I also have been diagnosed with PTSD and have severe depression issues as well as horrible anxiety based on death, that flares up and makes it nearly impossible to sleep. Story 22. When my daughter was 6 months old, she had a series of seizures and stopped breathing. She is my first and only child, so I had no idea what was happening or what to do. I started screaming as she started turning blue and yelled at my boyfriend at the time to call 911. He was confused because he was in the next room, but took my word for it and called. I remember her eyes rolling back in her head in a small grimace that looked almost like a smile on her face, while I tried gently shaking her to get her to respond. I do not remember actually screaming, but it must have been me yelling, "Oh my God, my baby is dying." The screaming sounded like some kind of animal. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was breathing but lethargic. She ended up having pneumonia, which affected her breathing. I did not find out for another 2 weeks. The hospital that took her accused me of making it up. I had been in the psych ward for cutting myself a few months prior, and they held her for almost a week. They did not give her any treatment, even though the X-ray tech had found what looked like pneumonia in her lungs. After they finally released her to my care, I took her to a different hospital. Story 23. This came into the top of my head, but it is not as scary as some of the replies in this thread. When I was about 10 or 11, there were 5 of us, including me, just casually walking on the street. One of my friends decided it was a good idea to chuck some pebbles at this house because of a mild grudge. We chucked them and ran as fast as we could to the next street, about 200 meters away from the house. We gasped for breath and were cracking up laughing at how funny we thought it was. Suddenly, my sixth sense crawled in, and I felt something bad. I did not know what it was, but I felt something bad. A powerful, angry aura. I turned around, and about 150 meters away from us was this huge bodybuilder, looking 20-year-old, running as fast as he could toward us. I froze for a couple of seconds and turned to my friends who were oblivious, and I yelled, "Run! He is coming after us." They saw him, froze for a couple of seconds, and then we all ran away as fast as we could. We split into 2 groups, one group of 2 and the other group of 3, which I was in. The other group ran to the street in the direction of our house. Unfortunately for my group, we had to take the other direction toward the park, and to make matters worse, the chaser, filled with anger, chased after our group. I knew the park in the area well enough to know the park had 2 streets to exit. We played mind games and waited at one of the streets to see where our chaser would choose. After seeing which street, he chose my 2 friends, and I went the other way. Unfortunately, he was also playing mind games and turned back, which we quickly responded to by hiding in a bush. We were fortunate the park was hilly, and we were at the top while he was at the bottom, seeing every move of his. After he walked past us, we ran away from the bush and had to take the long way home. After that event, we never went back to the street where the house was located, which meant we had to take the long way when we walked to school. But we all saw the funny side and laughed about it for a long time. Story 24. My child, not quite 2, was choking on a metal washer. I did not know what it was at the time. My husband came running to me, holding our son under his arms, and told me he was choking. I told him to get our other small kids in the car and call 911. I could not see a thing in his throat, and he was going white. I started doing back blows, and if any of you are ever in this situation, you cannot be gentle. If you are around kids, take a class. Anyway, I did abdominal thrusts and still nothing. At this point, I came over with this cold feeling, and I picked him up with my left arm again, almost completely head down, and headed out the door, banging the poor kid between his shoulder blades as I went. My husband had tossed the kids in the back, had the engine started and the phone out. As I went over our step, there was a clink and a washer hit the stones. Our son gasped and started to cry, and it was a beautiful sound. All was well. I have had bad stuff happen to me, but this was far worse. I do not know how much time passed, but I think it was less than 2 minutes. Still a long time to be terrified. He is 14 now and a terrific kid. I am very grateful to my college first aid instructor. I cannot recall his name, but he was the top hazardous materials firefighter in Denver at the time. He made us practice dealing with a choking child over and over, and I think that course saved my son's life. Story 25. When I was 12, I went camping in the Minnesota Boundary Waters with my father and sister. For those who do not know, the Boundary Waters are a massive camping area where you canoe to different sites located far out in the middle of nowhere. On the first night after dinner, we were cleaning our plates and we started to hear gunshots off in the distance. Considering we were 8 miles out in the middle of nowhere, we wondered where they were coming from. The gunshots persisted throughout the night until 11, when we heard a motorboat headed in our direction from about 200 yards out. My father, who was convinced that motorboats were not allowed, that far out believed they were fishermen and was angry because of how loud they were. They ended up parking their boat across the stream from us about 100 yards away from our tent. My sister and I could make out bits and pieces of their conversation, and from what we could tell, these guys were unsavory folk we did not want to mess with. My father, on the other hand, still convinced they were fishermen, insisted on getting out of our tent to tell them to be quiet. My sister and I begged him not to go out, but he would not listen. He got out, flashed his light at them, and we were immediately yelled at by the men. After cussing us out, my father commented on their foul language, which also gave away his thick Eastern European accent. They began calling him a commie bastard and said they would be back for him. They then shot off a bright flare into the sky so they could see us as they sped off in their motorboat. After a few minutes of shock, we crawled back into our tent and discussed what we would do if they returned. We decided our best bet would be to flee to the woods. About 30 minutes later, we heard 2 motorboats headed toward us. Without hesitation, the 3 of us got up, grabbed our bag, which had a flare map and compass, and fled into the woods. After running about 100 feet in, we sat down and waited. We first heard their boats scrape up against the rocks of our campsite. The noise pollution where we were was non-existent, so we could hear almost everything they were doing. We heard the men get out of their boats, unzip our tent, and begin yelling. Once they realized we were not there, they began going through our belongings and threatening us. They went into detail about how they would hurt us when they found us, and maybe if we were lucky, they would kill us first. This went on for about an hour and a half. Eventually, we heard one of them say they should leave, and although the leader seemed reluctant, they left shortly after. Somehow, we were able to get on our cell phone and call the police station. We explained our problem and were told officers would be dispatched to investigate. I still do not know how we had the courage to do this, but after the phone call, we got back into our tent and went to sleep. The next day, they sent out 2 officers by boat plane to get our statement. We learned the men had been arrested in possession of firearms and other illegal paraphernalia. We ended up camping the rest of the week and we enjoyed it. I cannot say I will be back anytime soon, though. Story 26, I live in your typical suburban subdivision on a cul-de-sac with no through traffic, and it is usually quiet and mundane. I do not worry much about crime. I often leave the garage door up on our split level because if I want to smoke a cigarette, I go out into the garage. I fell asleep on the couch downstairs in my den and woke up around 4 a.m. I walked out to the garage, lit up a smoke, and sat down on a camp chair I keep in the back of the garage. We keep our cars parked in the driveway and use the garage for storage. After a few minutes, I heard some noise from the front porch and did not think anything of it because we have a few feral cats outside that we take care of, and they will slide their food bowl around. The garage was dark. As I was sitting there, a guy dressed in all black walked down our stairs, black pants, black hoodie, black backpack, and black ski mask, and flipped the door handle on my wife's locked car. This was happening about 10 feet away from me. I was scared and watched him walk around the front of her car and across the entrance to the garage. And just as he put his hand on the door handle of my SUV, I loudly said, "Hey, you need something." He was probably more scared than I was. He quickly turned and looked into the dark garage with eyes as big as dinner plates and took off running straight across the street and through the neighbor's yard. I went inside, got my pistol, big flashlight, and cell phone. I called the cops and they drove around the development for about 20 minutes but never found him. When the cops showed up and asked how I scared him off, I told him, I said, "Hey, you need something." He said, "Nice," and we both chuckled. Story 27. As a New Zealander in completely different time zones, this will probably get buried. But anyway, when I was 9, 4 classes from my school had end-of-year camp. The main activity was to trek in a remote part of New Zealand called the Urewera. This is a forest and mountain region with pathways about 2 feet wide high up in the mountains. The paths were so narrow that groups of 6 could only move in one line. Every day for 5 days, we walked along these pathways for 3 hours until we came to our campsite. The walks were long, and we got tired and hungry. One day in particular, we were in one of the higher parts of the mountain. 100 meters ahead of us, other people from our group were eating and resting. This caused one boy behind me to get excited. So he and his rather large stomach pushed past me, and I lost my balance and went over the cliff. I woke up because I thought I was gone, looking down at rocks in a river with a strong current, then looked up to realize a parent was holding me by the ankle. I was hanging upside down. Of course I started crying. His words and calm voice kept me steady, so I grabbed onto a tree to hoist myself up. Of course, to add to the drama, the tree roots came loose and tumbled down the cliff. I grabbed onto another tree and was helped back onto the pathway. I remember my hair being filled with leaves and a group of kids standing around watching. I was terrified, and 20 years later, I still remember this clearly. The parent's name was Eddie. The boy's name was Patera. Story 28. When I was a junior in high school, I went to a party in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. I was having a good time until a random windstorm called a derecho violently attacked our entire neighborhood with 100+ miles per hour winds. People were intrigued, scared, and drunk. Suddenly, I received a call from my mom who frantically screamed, "Our house is on fire. Call 911," before the signal was lost. I started freaking out and dialing 911, but received only busy signals. I became the life of the party because I was crying, hysterically freaking out, and unsure of what to do, while still fairly inebriated. Some girls tried to console me, and one offered me a ride home, which I immediately accepted. The only problem was there were a million trees blocking the road. I told the girl who was sober to drive on people's front yards because I absolutely needed to get home to see if my family was okay. When I arrived home an hour later, there was a very large pine tree between my kitchen and my living room, splitting my house into two parts. Luckily, the fire was contained by the firefighters who had seen the fire from the next street over, even without the call going through. I will never forget how scared my mom sounded during my 3-second phone call with her, and I will never forget her facial expression when she told me how the tree had fallen just inches from where she was sitting in the living room on the couch trying to keep our dog calm. Story 29. 10 years ago, when I was just getting into the mindset of maturing past yay, I am out of high school and now I need something to do. I got work at a party store. Mostly it was themed party items, but during Halloween we would bring in costumes. I had only been at the store for a month, maybe more, and had a little pride in keeping the costumes stocked along the walls without too much mess. Halloween day, about 2 o'clock, two ladies came into the store. They were there because the younger of the two, in her early 30s, wanted to get a certain costume for her older son. He had been asking to have that one costume for weeks, so she wanted to surprise him with it. She was in high spirits, bouncing on her feet, full of energy, as she complimented us on how great the place looked and how thankful she was that we could help. She and her friend walked down the aisle toward the boys' costumes, and she got maybe 15 feet from us when she stopped and grabbed her head. Suddenly, she screamed at the top of her lungs, "Ow, my head!" and she went down hard. My manager freaked out and rushed to call 911. Her friend was screaming and grabbing for her. The lady was on the ground, twitching, her eyes wide open, her head wrenched to the side, giving this horrible grimace, and I assumed she was having a stroke. I tried to pull her mouth open with her friend's help, but her jaw was clenched so hard I could not open it. Her friend was screaming at us to do something, screaming her name, and refused to let go of her hand even when the paramedics showed up. My manager and I were sobbing. We did not know what to do, so we stood to the side as they wheeled her out. As she passed, her head was still turned to the side, and her eyes were wide open, so it looked like she was staring at us in horror as she went out. The paramedic told us the woman had died before she even hit the ground. She had a brain aneurysm that took her out within seconds, so when she went past us still twitching and staring at us, we were gazing back into dead eyes. Funnily enough, when it comes time for Halloween, and sometimes at random, we think we see a brown-haired lady wandering an aisle, or see a hint of a blue shirt, or hear a woman's voice when no one else is in the store but two workers. We have even felt someone standing behind us at the balloon counter, and it has gotten to where we hate being in the store alone when opening in the mornings. Story 30. I was a junior in high school last year. I had to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning to catch the bus. I remember it so clearly. I left my house at 5:45 a.m. and took my regular shortcut to my bus stop. My cousin usually walked with me since we went to the same school, but he stayed home that day. I was used to the darkness of the morning and had no worries at all. I thought it was going to be a regular school day like always. I was walking to my bus stop listening to Jack Johnson on my phone when a white truck rolled up in front of me. I was facing the passenger side. The truck was probably about 20 to 30 feet away. I took off my headphones and stood there. I thought they were tourists who got lost after a night of clubbing since I live in a popular tourist area. The passenger window rolled down and it was too dark to identify any face. The door opened and a guy stepped out. He started walking toward me briskly and said something, but I did not catch it. Next thing I knew, he was sprinting at me full speed. My glasses got knocked off my face and I fell onto the cold concrete of the parking lot. Everything was blurry, flashes of light filled my vision. My phone was ripped from my hands and my wallet was taken from my pocket. I think another guy started kicking the left side of my face while I got punched on the right. I did not get knocked out. They left me with one final blow to the right cheek. His fist slipped off my face and broke my favorite red headphones. Thankfully, they only hit my face and I did not suffer severe damage. The worst injury I got was a black and bloodshot eye. They scampered back to their truck and sped off into the early morning darkness. I will never forget the blurry image of my right arm splayed out in front of me and that truck speeding down the road. I felt like I was in a movie intro. I lay there for 2 minutes trying to process what had happened. I got up, picked up my glasses, thank God they were not broken, and said out loud, "I am not going to school today," before heading home. Story 31, I was 8 years old and woke up in the back seat of my mother's van with no idea where we were or what was happening, and my face was covered in blood. Winter wind and snow were blowing in through the sliding door, and I could hear voices all around but could not see anyone, until a strange man came over, handed me a blanket, and told me to hold it to my face, then disappeared again. There were flashing lights everywhere. A couple of seconds later, the pain hit, and I drifted into shock. It turned out we had been hit head-on by another car that had sped around a corner in the snow and drifted into our lane. The driver of that car broke his back, and the passenger died, so the EMTs prioritized them over the kids in the van. The other kids had climbed out, but I was unconscious from hitting my head and was left alone inside. My mother had run to the nearest house to call 911 and had just returned when the ambulance arrived. I ended up with a severe concussion, partial amnesia, with no memory of the entire day, which made it all scarier. Every bone in my face broken, really. Just my nose and right orbital and my upper lip detached from my gum line, so you could see into my sinuses. I spent about 8 hours in the ER waiting for the on-call oral surgeon to come through the snow to stitch my mouth back together. Meanwhile, I lay there with no idea what was happening, essentially in shock and afraid to move, because it felt like my face would fall off. I ended up with a twisted nose because they refused to try to set it due to the other damage. I had plastic surgery at 17 to fix as much as they could, but I still have a slightly crooked nose. Throughout my most formative years, though, Story 32, I was once walking home after a night of moderately drinking and smoking at a friend's place. I used to live in the city center about 2 kilometers from where my friend lived, so the route home was really urban. As I was walking, I passed a guy standing on the sidewalk with his bike. I kept walking, and a minute later he passed me with his bike. Nothing strange. After I walked a bit further, I noticed he was standing ahead looking at me. Strange, but I ignored it. As I got closer, he moved along. Halfway home, I had to cross a big marketplace. When I was in the middle of it, I noticed the guy biking along the edges of the place. If I continued, I had to go into a street off limits for cars because they were replacing internet cables underground for the next 800 meters. The street was one long construction site with only a narrow pedestrian path. I was very aware of the guy by now and sure as hell did not want to enter a narrow path with him behind me. I was certain he had chosen me as his victim, and I was scared. I stopped in a well-lit place to see what he would do, and he stopped too. At this point, I was convinced he was waiting for me. I could not call the cops because technically he had done nothing wrong, so I took a cab that was waiting nearby. As I got in, the guy realized his gig was up and moved into the street I was supposed to walk into. 5 minutes later, the cab driver dropped me off close to my house after a long detour due to the construction. As I was taking out my wallet, I noticed the guy biking past again. Luckily, he did not see me and I got inside safely.